This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. In a series for the Washington Post, reporter John Woodrow Cox shows us the collateral damage that can be done as a result of gun violence, but he does it through the eyes of children and teens who have experienced it firsthand. His series has racked up a number of prestigious honors this year, including EWA's Hechinger Grand Prize for Distinguished Education Reporting. And he joins us today. John, welcome to EWA Radio.
Thanks so much for having me.
You know, what really stood out for me in this series is that you pick up where many reporters probably left off. That is, the first day coverage of the shooting, or maybe a few days or weeks of the aftermath. And then you're taking a longer lens view and stepping back in.
Right. That was the idea, was, how do you cover a topic that has been covered a great deal, gun violence and its impact on children, but do it in a way that feels fresh and new and alarming, I think, too, and have a sense of urgency. And that was the idea. We thought that if we told these stories through the eyes of kids, that would feel different, and often in moments when sort of the rest of the world had moved on.
There's a wide range of diversity in your stories. Geography, their ages, their socioeconomic status, the kind of gun violence they've experienced. Let's talk about the first story in your series and why you started in Washington, D.C.
That was really where we wanted to start the series, in the place that we thought sort of most represented the way that kids are impacted by gun violence. And that's not typically in schools directly. That's just in their neighborhoods, and often it's a family member. It's a cousin or a friend. The little boy that we followed in Washington, his name was Tyshawn, and he had twice experienced gun violence. Once in a playground, he was on a slide when somebody opened fire. And then again, once when he was just playing video games at his father's house. Somebody started shooting outside and he had to jump behind the bed. He knew his father's friends had been killed, and then one day, when he was in second grade, his father was killed right outside of his school in the middle of the day. I came into Tyshawn's life immediately after that and followed him at a vigil, at the funeral, getting ready for the funeral, and then I went back to school with him as well. And what struck me about Tyshawn is that he is not a kid who anyone legally considers a victim of anything. He wasn't shot. He didn't even witness the shooting. But his life was dramatically changed by that act of gun violence, and it bled into every piece of his life, including school, just his ability to focus and his ability to learn. So many of these kids in that school, it's a difficult neighborhood, and many of them had experienced gun violence in some form, and you could tell that it really made it difficult just to go to school every day and to try to learn anything.
We talk a lot right now about there being a spotlight on campus shootings and gun violence, but your series to me was a good reminder that spotlights can be blinding and that there's a lot of important things happening in those gray areas right outside the edges.
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. And often the people and the kids specifically who we think of when we talk about gun violence are not kids like Tyshawn. They are the kids maybe in Parkland or even the kids who are shot themselves. But the ripple effect of an act of gun violence is enormous. And that's really what Tyshawn represents. One of the things that really stuck out to me about the reporting in that story was they had asked the kids at that school to draw pictures of what makes them sad about their neighborhoods. And dozens of these kids drew pictures of violent crime scenes in which people were being shot and people running from bullets. And these were kids who were all in first, second, or third grade. And none of those kids, again, none of them had been shot, but they were absolutely directly affected by gun violence.
I want to stay with Tyshawn's story for a moment because it has what I think are some hallmarks of your really excellent reporting, and that is the richness of these details. One example, when his mom came to tell him that his father had been shot, she didn't just do it in the front seat of her car. They were in her gray Dodge Durango. And that's a relatively small detail, but it takes it to another level. How intentional are you about that, or is it more instinct?
No, I'm very intentional. I mean, especially when I'm reconstructing or immersing. This story was some of both. Some of it was scenes that I had reconstructed because I had not seen them myself, and then others were things that I did witness. My goal is always to make a reader feel like they're there, I think the emotional impact is much greater when these things are vivid. And being in a car versus being in her car, that feels a little bit different for a reader, and it feels a little bit more real.
I want to talk about your reporting from South Carolina about a story set around a shooting at Townville Elementary School. I think this is an important story, not just for what you found in Townville, but as far as I can tell, this is where you were the first reporter to ask the question, how do we figure out how many students have been bystanders to campus gun violence? What did you figure out? How did you do that?
So I had at first assumed that the federal government probably tracked this, and I remember emailing people and saying, hey, who tracks this? Where's a database for this? And I quickly came to understand that no one did. No one was tracking how many children are affected in schools by shootings. And I really wanted to understand that figure because much of my reporting in South Carolina focused on children who had not been shot. They had just been in the school, they had been witnesses, and some of them hadn't even been witnesses. Some of the kids who were deeply traumatized couldn't even hear the shots. They were just there that day. And so what that said to me was that, I needed to understand how many children these kids represented. And I really just found that out through Nexus searches. I went through thousands of stories trying to figure out how many kids had been in schools where there had been a shooting. We ended up turning that into a database, and right now that count stands at more than 215,000 children who've been in schools when an act of gun violence occurred on their campus.
Has anything changed about the Washington Post process or policies when it comes to counting campus shootings? There's been some disputes and disparities in how different media outlets are counting those.
We had a really strict definition. So we were only looking at K through 12 schools. And the reason we discounted colleges is because we couldn't quantify how many students would have been impacted or on campus at that time because colleges are obviously enormous. We only counted shootings that happened during school hours or immediately before or after. And if it was before or after, then we would reduce the number of children who we count. We would only count half. We would subtract for the standard rate of absence every day, and we wouldn't count things like suicides that no one witnessed. We took a very narrow definition. I think that the most narrow that any outlet has taken, and we still found well in excess of 200 shootings since Columbine that fit our definition.
Interviewing kids can be intimidating, even for education reporters who do it on a regular basis, and even when you're not talking about a child that's experienced extreme trauma. What are some of your approaches here?
I really just want the kid to feel as comfortable as possible. I think that in some ways, kids are definitely harder to interview, but in some ways, I think they're easier too, because there isn't that filter that we as adults have. Kids will say what is on their mind in that moment. Often, I would just spend the first half hour getting to know the kid, telling them about me and what I do, and then just asking them about their favorite things. And that's where it would begin. And then, I would just ask really simple, open-ended questions like, tell me what happened that day, and how did that make you feel in that moment? I found for me, one of the most effective techniques was to just sit on the floor. I always wanted their eye level to be above mine, because I thought that would make me a lot less intimidating. They were just having a conversation with somebody who was really interested in their life.
We're talking with John Woodrow Cox of the Washington Post about his reporting on children and gun violence. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And don't forget to take a moment to rate us on iTunes. Your support and feedback will help us grow. John, let's turn for a moment to your coverage of the aftermath of a mass shooting at a country music festival in Las Vegas, where you feature 6 teens who are recovering from their experiences there. I noticed in that piece in particular, there's a lot of dialogue and reconstructed conversations, including ones that took place between children and parents and among friends when the shooting was actually happening. How do you do that?
The helpful thing in that story, there was a couple of things. One is I got there immediately after. So the shooting in Las Vegas was on a Sunday night, and I was on a plane Tuesday morning. And I had messaged on Facebook the mother of these twin girls who were shot, and she told me that they would be willing to let me in. So I just got on an airplane not really knowing what the story would be about. then I got there and found that there had been 10 students from this small Christian high school who had all been there at the shootings. I'd interviewed them in sets of 2 because they were all there in pairs. So everybody was able to confirm each other's memories. And for them, it was so vivid. It was the most vivid and traumatizing experience of their entire lives. So in those days immediately after, they still had really clear memories about what had happened and when and who had said what to whom. You know, one thing I find that's great about writing about teenagers especially is that they catalog every moment of their lives. Often through social media or texting. 2 of the girls took video while the shooting was happening. That was just their instinct, was to hold up their phones and record video. And so there was a lot of material to work with, and they were all really articulate and really intelligent young women who had just gone through an enormously traumatizing experience.
What's been the reaction from the people you've profiled? Have you had feedback from them? I'm thinking particularly about those who may be old enough to reach out to you and get back to them. The girls in Las Vegas, for example.
They all really appreciated the story. I mean, I think for them, they just appreciated having a chance to tell their story. You know, again, only 2 of the 6 had been shot. And I think under most circumstances, the other 4 would not have gotten that much attention because they weren't physically injured. And certainly in that shooting, so many people were shot that I think that's where most reporters went, is they went to people who had been wounded. I was as interested in people who had escaped, who had witnessed things, as I was with the twins who had actually been injured. And I think that for them, they all viewed it as a therapeutic experience, getting to talk to someone who was going to take their story to a larger audience and just getting to say it out loud. You know, for them, it happened during homecoming week, which for me added to the sorrow of it, added to the grief. Here was this iconic moment in every kid's life, and it was ruined.
One of the concerns that's been raised by researchers and some media experts is how much attention is given to the perpetrators of these crimes. The shooter in your South Carolina story about Townsville isn't even named until the last third of the piece. Did you consider not making him a character in the story at all?
I think that I knew he had to be one only because he was also a juvenile. He was 14 years old at the time of the shooting. And because all of these stories are about kids and told through their eyes, we knew that he had to be a figure in the story. But certainly the purpose was to not make him central to it. It was about these 4 children and what they had experienced. And they all had different trauma as a result. And they'd all reacted to it in different ways. But we did feel like this is a kid, too, who had gone to that school. You know, there's that moment in the story when the teachers are looking at the window at the shooter pacing the sidewalk, and suddenly they realize it's a boy who had attended that school. It's a 10-section story, and his section is the 9th one. And the idea there was to also, as much as I could, give people a sense of his perspective. Certainly the idea was to not make it another story about a school shooter, because that's a familiar story.
So, John, we talked about how you often come into these stories after the beat reporter has left for the day, but beat reporters are the core of our membership. And I'm wondering what ideas or suggestions you might have for them if they are the first person on that scene.
You know, a lot of what I learned about reporting on trauma, reporting on kids, I learned as a beat reporter, as a cops and courts reporter in Florida years ago. And, you know, the first thing that I always do is just to tell people how sorry I am for what they're going through. And I mean that sincerely. You know, I think that our first job is to be human, and our second job is to be a journalist. In these things, you're always coming into their lives at the absolute worst moment of their lives, and you need to respect that first, I think. You know, often people will say that, you know, they'd love to talk, but they're not ready or they don't want to. Or often they'll say, well, hey, can you just go talk to somebody else about my story or this story or what's happened to me? And, you know, I think that you have to give people an incentive to do this, especially if they're going to open up their kids to you. And so I think it's important to be mindful of what is the benefit for them. And I would always say that if someone has lost someone, for example, you know, it's a way to memorialize that person, is that stories can last forever. And I think the same is true of a traumatic moment, is it's a way for them to own that story. Here's what I've gone through, And this was my experience. And always, 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 especially as it relates to gun violence or any sort of trauma, they are not the only one who's experienced that. And I think if you can convey to them that their story can maybe help somebody else, or their kid's story can help someone else, so that that person knows that they're not alone, I think that's also really effective.
You're working on a book right now. What can you tell us about that?
Well, it's an expansion of the series. And, the book will get more into solutions. These stories very much lay out the trauma and the failures, I think, of, where America is right now. A lot of the book will get into maybe areas where we can improve, or we can do things that can actually reduce the number of children who are impacted by gun violence. It's not about gun control often. It's just about things that I think a lot of people could agree on. That's the hope, is that it's a book that sort of goes beyond just describing these kids' stories to also say, hey, here's maybe a path forward.
John Woodrow Cox, thank you for making time for EWA Radio. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
That wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story you want to know more about, drop us a line at radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, and thanks for listening.